What sort of level of knowledge do you think your audience has? I mean, I don't want to patronize them.
I would say confuse them is better, because we're more likely to have people that are aware of the things you're talking about.
So basically, most of the people who are going to hear this will be aware that there is a Shakespeare authorship problem.
Absolutely.
There's just a thought that occurs to me, is that that things are very odd at the moment in the world, and there's a lot of, I believe there's a great deal of deception going on. And what interests me a bit about this is that this seems to be a very early example of the type of deception that is using very often the very same symbols, the very same ideas to hide things, possibly even to jeer at us, that we're seeing in the modern world apropos of all sorts of things. I mean, modern politics.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
A man you would never want to end a sentence in a preposition with. Alexander Waugh, thank you very much for making the time to come out. The leading expert, as far as I've been able to research, on the Shakespearean anti-Stratfordian authorship problem, as well as being from a family of writers and probably an expert in every way on the idea of literary phonology and writing itself. Someone who could probably look at a piece of writing and tell you who wrote it.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be on your podcast. That's very kind, and I'm honoured, and I'm slightly embarrassed by your flatteries. I don't think I'm nearly as expert as you think I am. I'm just someone who's been very, very dogged and smelt a rat quite a long time ago, reading books on William Shakespeare, traditional authorship biographies of William Shakespeare, and realizing that there was a massive hole in it. I was absolutely by no means the first person to realize that there was problem, but I got my jaws into it, my teeth into it, and couldn't let go, because I knew it was wrong. I knew it wasn't just wrong, it was flat out silly what was being said about William Shakespeare. This idea that he was a man who had written all these magnificent and incredible and learned plays, and yet had no evidence of an education, no evidence that he was bright in any sense, that none of his family seemed to be able to write, etc., etc., etc. So, like a lot of other people, I just locked into that, and it became something of an obsession. One could even say I rather tipped up the whole of my career in order to pursue this. At the time I started it, which was about 10 years ago or so, it was still considered a very vulgar, very stupid thing to be, and a so-called anti-Stratfordian, that is to say, someone who doesn't believe that William Shakespeare was William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon. So all my connections with publishers, with newspapers where I used to work as a reviewer, suddenly became rather soured, as they thought that I was going off in some sort of mad direction. 10 years have passed, and a hell of a lot has happened in that time. And I think it's now, oddly enough, far more respectable to be saying that Shakespeare was a pseudonym.
People have been so afraid to look into this for 400 years that it's waited this long. So I appreciate your passion and confidence to make this available for the people. Do you remember when you first realized that Shakespeare was probably not himself? I think I was in third grade, and there was Scholastic Book Fair came to town, and they showed us the Mask picture. And I was convinced at that moment he probably wasn't a grammar school educated guy. What do you think you first started to think?
Yeah, look, I get a very strong feeling that your skepticism came in an awful lot earlier. I mean, I remember sitting, I suppose I was about 11 or 12 years old, at the table with my family, and my the father told me for the first time I'd ever heard it that there were people going around saying that William Shakespeare was someone else, probably Francis Bacon. And my mother shut him up immediately. My mother, very keen on Shakespeare, and used to be able to quote yards of it, and said absolute rubbish, completely silly, and one didn't sort of bother to pursue it. But I remember pricking up my ears and thinking, that's really interesting, and wanting to follow it. When I was about 18 or 19, I suppose, I started reading biographies of Shakespeare and realizing how badly they stank, how little evidence there were. But it's not really till you get into the history of that period, the Tudor period, when you realize that there is so much about all the other writers. I mean, there's no excuse for there being nothing about Shakespeare, none whatsoever. So then, as I said, I became like a sort of truffle hunting pig and went on and on and on. Now, in the olden days, well, about a lot of things, people say, if you want to get to the bottom of a mystery, you follow the money. Well, there wasn't exactly much money that I could follow very easily, but I took a different path, which turned out to be an extremely rich seam, a very rich mine, which was to say, well, there's no money to follow, but follow the burials, follow the churches. Have a look very, very hard at that rather mystical statement that appears on William Shakespeare's memorial in Stratford-upon-Avon, which nobody really seems to understand or know what it means. And from that very simple basis, I had the epitaph to Shakespeare's memorial in Stratford-upon-Avon. I had it by my bed, and every night I had a big cardboard version of it, and every night I picked it up and I stared at it, and I said, "No, nothing yet. Don't understand it yet." I put it back. Then the next night I did the same. Every night for about a month or 2 months, and suddenly I was looking at it one night, and I saw this space, this gap between the word "with" and the word "in." So on this monument it says, "Stay, passenger, why goest thou by so fast? Read if thou canst, whom envious death hath placed within this monument, Shakespeare." And I thought, why the hell is that gap there? Why isn't it within this monument? Well, a lot of people have said it was just a mistake. It should have said within, not within this monument. And then they started inventing the most fantastical excuses, saying that Shakespeare was buried in that monument. Well, that's rubbish, because the monument is stuck on a wall. It's a wall plaque. There's no room possibly for a body to be in it. So then I realized that it was concealing a riddle, and read another way. It says, "Stay, passenger, why goest thou by so fast? Read if thou canst, whom envious death hath placed with," and then take out "in this monument, Shakespeare." So in other words, who is death placed with Shakespeare? Who is Shakespeare buried with? Work out if you can. Read if thou canst. Work it out if you can. In this monument, by reading this monument, who Shakespeare's buried with it with. And that was the start of an extraordinary journey I have taken. Absolutely phenomenal journey, not only in proving who Shakespeare was, but where he's actually buried, and busting open the whole story. But that was the beginning of it, really.
I'm absolutely floored by your videos. I think you've done a completely cogent job of showing the proof that this is the case, that this is not written by a grammar school educated person. I think already a lot of us can intuitively see that the creation of words that Shakespeare used would have required an education. A polylingualist would have had to be aware of Latin and so many other things in order to turn Beowulf English into Shakespearean English.
Se ägale Isten dues, Deok det shui tugedon yoga the semra, etc.
That's absolutely right, and marry that to the fact that William Shakespeare of Stratford knew nobody at all. So you've got these plays that are absolutely full of legal writing. Did he know a single lawyer? Not as far as we know. We've got these plays that are absolutely full of jokes and ideas about the court and how it behaves and the majesty. And did he know a single person in the court? No. They are full of scholarship. Did he know a single scholar of those days, who, by the way, were all often grouped together in the same rooms under the same patrons? No, he didn't know a single one. And even more extraordinary, perhaps, is, did he know another poet or another playwright? Well, the Stratfordianists sometimes say, oh, he knew Ben Jonson, but there isn't actually a single piece of evidence from Shakespeare's lifetime, that's to say from the lifetime of William of Stratford. There's not a single piece of evidence that showed he knew a single other playwright. And yet, if you look at the lives of all those other playwrights, you find they all knew each other. And one of the most extraordinary things about it is they all knew the Earl of Oxford. And if you want to tease a Stratfordianist, you say to him, there's just one little problem with your theory that William of Stratford wrote these plays. They're already getting cross if you put the question like that, by the way. But one little problem with your theory. And they say, what's that then? And you say, he didn't know the Earl of Oxford. And the Earl of Oxford seemed to know every single poet and playwright in town, because he was running a great scriptorium of playwrights and writers. So the fact that he didn't know William Shakespeare and no other playwrights and no other poets knew him is extremely damning to the traditional case.
So it's pretty interesting that, you know, you mentioned legal knowledge, polylingual, you know, or etymological understanding, things that probably this guy, Stratford educated kid, couldn't have understood. But we've also looked around other names. There's been talk about John Dee. There's been talk about Francis Bacon, like you said. I think that was where I had first heard it as a child. But then we start hearing more about De Vere, you know, this brilliant poet who, I mean, there's a better way to describe De Vere than the most educated man at the time and the most popular. Well, how would you describe De Vere, and what is his place in all this?
So De Vere was a wild card. He was a kind of crazy guy. I would think of him in terms of Byron, Lord Byron, the poet, a little bit in terms of my own grandfather, Evelyn Waugh. I mean, these people who were sort of really quite tricky, difficult people, but they were geniuses, and at the same time had a large amount of very, very loyal friends around them, despite the fact that the press and people loved to say that they were complete shits and misfits. He was someone who went bankrupt, basically spending money on plays and entertainments and setting up theatres, very obsessed by all of that stuff. But also he was robbed by Lord Leicester. He was very highly rated in his day as a poet and playwright. This is another odd thing. So if you go to a traditional Stratfordianist and say, look, we've got 2 or 3 references here from the day saying he's the best playwright in town, what's happened? And they say, oh, well, all his plays have disappeared. They've all been lost, you know, really extraordinary. So you have the so-called greatest playwright according to his contemporaries, with all his plays have been entirely lost. And then on the other hand, you've got this absolutely unique, complete collection of 36 plays that came out in 1623 as the great folio of William Shakespeare, attributed to a man who is totally absent from the literary records of his time. So it doesn't take a genius to think, well, maybe the lost plays of Edward de Vere are the plays of the lost man, William Shakespeare.
Shakespeare grew up in a household in the town known as Stratford-upon-Avon, a household where no one really knew how to write. The family would sign official papers with a mark and not with a name, which could be an indication of illiteracy. Even further, in this critical and definitive text devoted to the subject of Shakespearean authorship, author Frank Davis is shown as proving William Shakespeare was indeed illiterate, showing that every single recorded and known signature of Shakespeare was completely jumbled up scribble and bared no resemblance to the spelling of his actual name. Do you think the greatest, most clever author of all time could have difficulty spelling his own name?
Well, it's interesting when you start to think about the education of De Vere, right? I mean, he was educated in the Cecil House. He had tutelage from Italy and from places where the original versions of these plays, I mean, Romeo and Juliet's about Verona. I mean, so many of these plays are from stories a century earlier that had been brought and translated, and you can even see there are Latin translations done by De Vere or in the publishment of De Vere, correct?
So people who are anti-De Vere, and this happens quite a lot on purely emotional grounds, because he was an English aristocrat, so they assume straight off that he was privileged, etc., and all the things that modern people hate. So people who are anti-De Vere say, well, he's very egocentric if he wrote all these plays, because his favorite writer in the world was Ovid. And when Ovid's Metamorphoses was first published in English, the translation was made by his uncle, who was called Arthur Golding, who at that very time was also his tutor. So he became very, very obsessed with Ovid, and everybody knows, all the scholars know, let's say, that Ovid is the favorite playwright of William Shakespeare. Now, Ovid calls his most famous book The Metamorphoses, and it's about changing, you know, people changing into animals and everything changing. And the very sort of end of Ovid's Metamorphoses, he totally disappears. He himself metamorphoses into his works. And that is precisely what Shakespeare did. He disappeared and turned himself into his works. It was actually a very noble and a very, in some ways, a very tragic thing, but a very inspired thing to have done. And so what he did was he put he washed his dirty linen, if you want it that way. He put his whole life, all the sordid parts of it, as well as the greater parts of it, into his plays. And you can look at those plays and see straight away that they are extraordinarily autobiographical. I mean, just to give you a few very obvious examples. So Edward de Vere is in Venice when he's told that his wife has betrayed him. And clearly this is exactly what happened to Othello. Now, Othello murdered his wife, but Edward de Vere didn't. But he repudiated her and behaved very badly, and like Othello, was extremely sad and sorry afterwards. Now, so obsessed is he with this problem and the way he dealt with his wife that it's not just Othello, it's not just one play. He does it 3 times. He's part of this sect, if you like, that believes that everything in threes is perfect. And so he writes the play Cymbeline, about an Englishman who goes to Rome, who believes his wife is unfaithful and then grovels in apology. He writes a play called Winter's Tale, which, by the way, is punning on the French idea of le conte d'hiver, which means, if you speak French, the tale of winter, the winter's tale. But of course, it sounds very like the tale of Vere, the Comte de Vere, which is what's going on. And it is indeed extremely autobiographical. Once again, there's the king who believes his wife has had a baby that isn't his and gets absolutely furious and then grovels in apology. This is precisely what happened to Vere. And so on and on and on this goes. I mean, if you look at King Lear, for instance, there's a play about a man who gives his ancient patrimony away to his 3 daughters and then regrets it terribly when things go wrong. What did Edward de Vere do? He gave his ancient patrimony, that's to say, the castle at Hedingham, that was the family seat since the Conqueror's time in 1066, and he gave that away to his 3 daughters, and it all went pear-shaped. I mean, I could go on, but you know, even the lesser-known plays are extremely autobiographical. So he is, if you like, confessing his life through his works, which is precisely what Ovid did, his great champion, the writer that he admired best.
I think we mentioned earlier, I don't know if we mentioned on this show, but Evelyn, your grandfather, was one of the favorite, if not the most influential writer on Bill Buckley, who's, you know, in America, I think he's maybe still remembered to an extent, but he was known as a man who wrote Black Guy. Blackie was a spy. He was a skull and bones, Yale educated Catholic who wrote about CIA operations that he had. He was the Anderson Cooper of the 50s. And so much of these works we found later, I think Snepp was arrested in the 70s for writing a book about, or late 70s, 1981, for writing a book about the Vietnam conflict without the CIA's permission. And so they took back and sued him because out of contract, they said he didn't reveal anything illegal, but that he had illegally violated his contract to ask them for permission before he published things. But Blackie, in the books written by Bill Buckley, were never under the same, Black Eye books were never under the same sort of stipulations. This seems kind of similar in a lot of ways to these stories that came out. Maybe they're personal about de Vere, but also they're very influential on the royal court and what's going on with the proletariats looking at the royal court. Henry VII, is it the one where they try to seek out who might have been the secret writer because Queen Elizabeth thought this was surreptitious or it was seditious works. Do you think that there is a seditious or a social, what is the social impact of Shakespeare? Why was it important to hide their identity? What were they trying to do with Shakespeare to the culture?
Yes, so various things happened that we know about. And one of the most interesting things that happened was in the mid 1580s, when Edward de Vere went bust, essentially, and had nothing and was scraped up off the floor by Queen Elizabeth, who gave him £1,000 a year. This was in 1586, and it's exactly the same time when £1,000 a year, which, by the way, was an awfully large amount of money in those days. It doesn't sound like it now, but it really was then. That in that same year, 1586, the Exchequer, which was paying £1,000 a year into the Revels office, this is the office that produces the plays at the Royal Court, in that same year, they stopped the £1,000 a year. So it looks very much as Edward de Vere, who was, after all, known to be the greatest patron of the players and the plays, and a playwright himself, and of the actors, had the money that was going from the Exchequer to the Revels Office was then put in his hands to carry on writing the plays. Now, my belief is that he was previously writing comedies, not many of which seem to have been publicly performed. So I think they were mainly being shown at court. And from 1586, we suddenly get this knowledge of, because Thomas Nash tells us, the writer Thomas Nash, knowledge of what is called a secret policy of plays. And Nash, in his description of this, says that people, important people such as courtiers, lawyers, captains, scholars, they're all going off to the theaters and during the daytime and just arsing around and getting drunk and wasting time. So what are we going to do? We're going to make these plays really clever, really important, really inspiring, and we're going to make them history plays. So in other words, we're going to write the complete history of England that glorifies England, that makes people proud of their ancestry and their past and of their country. Of course, this is all the time leading up to the Armada and the great fight with the Spanish. So it's really important to get the sort of blood in the veins of the Englishmen and stop them slopping around watching rubbish on the stages. And so it becomes a government policy to do this. And it seems to anyone who's looked at it that Edward de Vere, because of the money I just mentioned and because his position within the court and within the theatre world, was the man who was essentially running this scriptorium. And out of that come the Shakespeare plays, so the Shakespeare history plays. So I think that Vere can't therefore either be exposed or punished when he's a bit too funny or a bit too quipping in some of those plays. So it's a slightly delicate situation with the Queen and Walsingham and high up people in the court who are admiring his amazing talent and what he's doing and his ability to rouse the British spirit, but at the same time are quite wary of him because he is a loose cannon.
Are you familiar with MK Ultra and Tavistock and some of these, movements of media financed by the government?
Yes, and I find them rather shifty.
Do you think that they're kind of a similar thing though? Because you look at, I think Cord Meyer in this scenario in the United States, Cord Meyer was in charge of a lot of CIA information or disinformation campaigns. He would still have to work with someone who was a literary genius like Bill Buckley. So it seems like you have this Cord Meyer is this Bacon-like figure, a liturgical, he's a lawyer, he's interested in, but if he had written the history of England, it would have been King Arthur, and it would have been a bit beige. And you look at De Vere's writing style and his eloquence, and it wouldn't have been possible to work alone. Do you think that there's probably a team of people working to make this possible?
Unquestionably, there's a team working to make it possible. And I can hear very easily Thomas Nash, who was the most brilliant writer of his day in terms of being rude, of invective, of throwing stuff. I mean, he comes pouring out of the Shakespeare works, and lots of people have said they can detect here and there the hand of Robert Greene, the hand of John Lilly, the hand of Anthony Mundy. Now, we know for a fact that all of these people were servants to the Earl of Oxford. So, I mean, the first question that you should ask anyone who doesn't seem to understand what's going on here is, why on earth does the Earl of Oxford need to have 5 or 6 people who we all know were playwrights as his secretaries? I mean, can you name another aristocrat or anyone at that time who had even 1, little 2, I mean, playwrights around their table?
Well, so, there's a scene in Young Indiana Jones where he comes in and sees the Nancy Drew authors, but there's 100 ghost authors just working and hacking away at typewriters to get the work out. Do you think it was like that, or do you think De Vere was the monopoly of the agenda?
No, I do think it was like that, and there's nothing dishonorable about that. I mean, it takes away the idea of this one sole supreme genius with a sheet of paper and a quill all on his own in a room working it all out. But what the hell, let's get to the truth of this matter. And we actually look at modern day films and all sorts of things which are done, I won't say by committee, but by collaboration of very bright, intelligent minds. And the way I look at this a bit is something that is totally accepted from the same period is how the great artists work. If you went to the studio of Tintoretto or even later Rubens or earlier Titian, I mean, these people had around them groups of quite often young, very talented people who wanted one day perhaps to make their names as great artists on their own. But take Titian, for example. So he would say, right, this is the subject of the painting we're now going to do. This is the form. This is the symbolism that is going to go into it. And the whole idea, if you like, the real creative, moving genius behind a Titian painting is Titian. But then he will get his apprentices to fill in that bit of grass that needs doing over there and help with the toga over here, and etc., etc. And very possibly, if they were bright young apprentices, they might say, well, how about this or that? And if, he will probably say that's a rubbish idea or that's a good idea. Now, we know that plays in those days were written by more than one person. Very, very often they were doing that. We know that Oxford had all these named playwrights around him. So it looks very much as though that was how it was working until, and this is the very interesting part, 1591, he completely crashed. He ran out of money, everything went wrong, and all of his scriptorum dissolved, and all those amazing writers went out onto the streets with begging bowls saying, how am I going to make money writing plays? And suddenly Oxford is alone, and it is an intrinsic part of the Oxfordian theory that from 1591 until his death in 1604, he was pretty well alone, and that what he was doing was revising all the great plays that had been written in the 70s and the 80s, and that helps to give them this very unified and distinctive and personal voice with those revisions. And we see, when we look at the early quartos of Shakespeare, they say recently revised or recently extended or lengthened or whatever by the author. And of course, in 1604, when Oxford dies, all that ends. There's no more revising going on, obviously, because he's dead, but a lot of people haven't understood that yet.
My word. So in other words, I mean, let me try to Americanize this for us. You have a George Lucas character who has many companies to build this Star Wars project that eventually gets picked up by Disney, and they're in charge of it, and they're telling him what to do, or they take the plays, or they take the medium and control it and what the message is. Do you think that that's how it ends up? It ends up in the hands of Cecil House, or?
Well, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, to know exactly how much of that process went on. I mean, I think we've got a very good sense that Cecil House, or let's say more correctly, perhaps the court, maybe let's call that the Privy Council, maybe, said to Oxford, we want a series of English history plays. We want one on each of the kings in succession. And as I said before, in order to embolden and encourage the British mind and stiffen the blood and the sinews. And now we know that the Revels Office, which lost all this money to Oxford, still continued. It still limped on. And we know that the Revels Office sometimes sent plays back with things crossed out and things that weren't acceptable and weren't provable. We have a manuscript of Thomas More, very, very interesting manuscript, that one, because it's got 4 or 5 different playwrights' hands in it, which then it does imply that if Oxford wrote it, which is one of the key hands in that is Anthony Mundy, who's known to be a servant of Oxford. If he wrote it, the thought is that he was going round and round the table, almost just spouting it out ad libitum, and that these different scribes were taking it down fast, and they were also scholars. And that is very likely the way it was done. We don't know for certain. We know that Oxford was lame. He had had some sort of accident, I think during a duel when he was very badly wounded. And it's possible that, I can't really confirm this, that he found it very difficult actually writing. Physically, he found it difficult writing. But he was a very good improviser. We know that. So I think it is possible that, given his extraordinary mind, that he was able to talk straight off in iambic pentameters and could just do that. And then that's how I mean, it is quite extraordinary how spoken they sound, those plays.
It's incredible. Like even Americans are able to do Shakespeare and to make it sound natural. So there's something very magical about that.
Americans, in my mind, do Shakespeare often much better than the English. They're much more natural actors. and I find the English, particularly in the present day and age, a very sorry bunch. Not every single one of them, but a lot of them appalling. They speak the lines as though they really don't understand them at all. They shout when all you need to do is seethe, and nearly everything they do is vulgar and wrong. And
Well,
of course, when we're now living in this present age, when you're not allowed to have King Lear as an old man on his deathbed, he has to be a very young, deaf and dumb lesbian person.
I saw him as an African king recently, and it was okay. But I'm
not saying it. I'm not saying this. It doesn't work. And
my
criticism.
I have seen a lot of lesbian Shakespeare recently. I think I saw an all-women's prison of London or Edinburgh do Julius Caesar, and so you're not wrong. But as a Fitzgerald from California, which is basically the Corsica of the United States, I can't completely identify with either. So I do think that Americans have taken Shakespeare to the beginning of where it was again. But let's look at this more as who are trying to get us to believe these things. Who are this Ocean 11, or I guess Ocean 1740 crew around this Shakespeare, Ed de Vere? You have, you said Nash, Moore. What's John Dee doing? What's Bacon doing? How are they connected?
One of the really interesting things I discovered was about where he was buried. And one of the ways I discovered where he was buried was by scrutinizing a particular text that not just me, but for years, hundreds of years, people have said must be encrypted. And the reason they've said that is because it's set out in 3 triangles. That the orthography of it is most peculiar. It's all capital letters with full stops, what you would call, what do you call them, points? No, you call them something. I call them full stops in punctuation, with periods between every word, and it doesn't make a great deal of sense. I'm talking about the dedication to Shakespeare's sonnets that was published in 1609. That was 5 years after Edward de Vere died. And actually, just to amuse your listeners, if they haven't heard it before, I'll just read it to you, because you can tell straight away that there's something deeply wrong with it, even if you can't see the layout which I've just described. To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet wisheth the well-wishing adventurer in setting forth. See? So you can see that something's been compromised. These are very, very clever people. They know how to speak proper English and make sense. So clearly they're asking about here. They've moved words around. They've moved letters around. They're putting it in 3 triangles. So for years and years, people have believed that this is encrypted in some sort of way. And just by saying to you that there were 3 triangles, that might say something to you or to some of your listeners, because 3 triangles, this idea of 3 times 3, it's a very Freemasonic symbol. In fact, if you look at the
or at least
Euclidean,
it's very Euclidean. I mean, the idea of angles for this is what connects to makes what is correct or right. You know, these 3 proofs.
Well, Euclidean and Freemasonic go fairly hand in hand. And in fact, John Dee, this great conjurer, mathematician, who famously wrote the preface to the works of Euclid, which was published in 1570. But the idea of hidden geometry is very key to Freemasons. And I know that the history of Freemasonry is fraught with arguments. So I tend to use the expression proto-Mason, proto-Masonic. So we're just slightly before the Masonic movement becomes official, but what we can see very, very plainly is exactly the same symbols are being used, the same numerical interests. So there clearly was a movement that was thinking very like the Freemasons before we officially started saying the word Freemasons to one another. We know about the Rosicrucians, for instance, who seem to pop up in about 1614, 1612, but there's clear evidence that John Dee, just by the symbolism alone that he's using, was connected to that group even before it existed, and even though we think it didn't appear till after his death. So what's really fascinated me about all the investigations I've done is that I discovered not just the church, but the part of that church and the exact spot within the part of that church where Edward de Vere was buried. And to my absolute astonishment, because I worked out where he was buried before actually going to that church, and I saw the spot where it was, and I said, I'm going to get straight into the car now, and I'm going to go straight up. This is Westminster Abbey, and look and just see if by any chance a little cross or a little mark on the stone where I've found out he's buried, just to prove I'm right. But where did the spot land? It landed directly on the place where in 1740 the monument to William Shakespeare was placed. And this told me absolutely straight away that the Freemasons, or Freemasonic group, had waited till 1740, because that's a very, very significant date, to place a monument to William Shakespeare directly on top of the remains of Edward de Vere. So I realized without any doubt whatsoever that this was connected to the Freemasons. And what fascinates me is what's going on today. And, you know, we're in a very, very strange position in the world today, and many odd things are happening. And it seems to a lot of us, those of us, I don't want to be conceited, but let's say those of us who are slightly more awake than others, that there's an enormous amount of deception going on using some of the same techniques, some of the same symbols, some of the same ideas that I found going on right back there in 1609. So I just have to say that my path to this, and we all take our own personal path, but my path to this was through Shakespeare. I wasn't really in any sense much of a conspiracy theorist apart from the Shakespeare thing, and I hadn't opened my eyes to what was going on in the present day and its connection to this type of Freemasonic weirdness and Freemasonic thought. But having taken that journey through Shakespeare, I became immediately aware of what's going on today. So it's a very extraordinary world.
If Shakespeare was created for this purpose, and we're seeing, you know, I agree entirely that today we have a very similar mass information campaign, and we've had a number of them since Shakespeare that seem to be modeled on the Shakespeare, that this guy would have possibly known about all these other places even, and the historical precedent set by these other cultures 100 years ago having princes and their relationships of royals specifically, as opposed to, he has proletariats, but the proletariats are off stage. They're in the crowd making these lines. This is very similar to Ayurvedic plays from ancient India. I would also say, though, looking at Euclid and Freemasonry, or proto-Masonry, I think is a fabulous term for this, because you're saying in the 1600s, so you have Hermetic scholars, you have French, Italian trade groups, you have people that are making secret agreements so that they can make sure that they're sure to be hired and that not some imposter is hired. What is it that happens that changes? I mean, we end up seeing Freemasonry is essentially illegal, and then it becomes the mode of the state. We lose Charles' head and we gain Cromwell. What is this transition here into the Sophia Naturalization Act? What happened to Protestant Freemasonry, and why did that take over? And what happened to Rosicrucianism, which seemed to be at the center with Bacon and Cecil and the Holy Roman Empire?
I think the relationship between Freemasonry and the state has never been very straightforward. It's been a relationship largely of infiltration, and parts of a state apparatus being Freemasonic, and another part of that same state having not much clue about it. And this goes back a very, very long way, by the way. When I say proto-Mason, I'm perfectly happy to include in that Pythagoras, for instance, who really is a long time earlier, and Plato. And we're talking about people who, I mean, very literally underwent a near-death experience, usually in some form of ritual. They got reborn and they became initiated into so-called ancient secrets. I don't know if you've heard of a book, a very successful book called The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth. I would recommend it to anyone who wants a sort of starter history of the world. What that book tells you is the history of the world as seen through the initiate's eyes, through going right through and taking in myths. It's an alternative history that is very much believed, and it's a what we call an idealistic history as opposed to a materialist history. And so we're currently in this period where the scientists and the materialists seem to have the upper hand. But do they have the upper hand? Because what we're also seeing is a huge amount of infiltration by Freemasons. Now, I have to be guarded about what I say about Freemasons as well, because I believe they themselves have suffered great infiltration, and they were infiltrated, as we know, in the 18th century by the so-called Illuminati under this man called Adam Weishaupt. And I think it looks to me that the Illuminati are almost purely wicked. I don't know how many of the Freemasons they've actually got on their side to run their dirty tricks. And I also believe absolutely firmly there are many Freemasons, many who I know, who are perfectly innocent people who join Freemasonry because they think it's going to be fun and it's a club, and they don't ascend very high up the ladder, and they're doing charitable good works for people and are perfectly decent, honorable folks. But I think I'm afraid to say that my present view of Freemasonry is that at its highest levels, it's rotten to the core. And I'm afraid I think the same about the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and nearly all of the Western governments. We don't even have to mention the governments of China and Russia because they've been so rotten for so long. We all know about it.
Power corrupts, I suppose, right? I mean,
well, does it need to? What about Cincinnati, who lends his name to your wonderful city, Cincinnatus, the man who went in and fixed things and went out again? And that's the way it should be.
Well, so I think also about in terms of Freemasonry, let's look at propaganda do. And so if you look at the GOI, the Grand Orientists of Italy, they were kicked out of in 76, I think. And in 1993, they were finalizing the kicking out of their group because they were so much more interested in working with the former king of Italy and trying to reestablish Italy as a non-European Union state. And now Europe has become a state. So there are groups of Freemasons which have been considered by other Freemasons to be actually secret societies, and they've been removed from Freemasonry. Now, are those the bad guys? I wouldn't necessarily say that the European Union are the good guys and that the Italian families are the bad. I mean, I don't want to say the mafia are the good guys either, but it's really hard when you're trying to pick the lesser of two evils, right? And you're living in Dante's Inferno.
It's very, very hard indeed. And all I can say is that the evidence is very strong that there are high-level Freemasonic groups behind quite a lot of the shit that's going down at the moment. And
also,
I would say,
really quickly though, Illuminati is, originally Loyola wanted to call the Jesuits the Illuminati. The Pope told him, just call it the Jesus Society instead. So, I mean, the idea of being awake, I mean, Illuminati is to be the woke in this generation.
Well, very technically, it means to be illumined, to have light. Light thrown on you, and you'll find that this is a common theme throughout all these groups, and people get very uppity about the so-called worship of Lucifer. The Lucifer is the light bearer, and if you ask a high up Freemason, he'll say, well, don't panic too much about that, because Lucifer isn't precisely the same person as Satan, and there's nothing too wrong with light bearing. There's a great deal of enthusiasm, one might say even more enthusiasm than some people would warrant, for the sun as the solar god, etc., etc. So the Illuminati are following the same path in the sense that they're claiming a righteousness through light, through illumination, and through the sun, through looks. So look, I'm with you on this. We're all trying to understand it. I'm going to tell you straight out, I'm not a Freemason or part of that group, and you might be, and that's up to you to reveal. And traditionally, the Catholics have been the enemies of the Freemasons. However, I think that in the top echelons of the Vatican, there's some very, very dodgy things going on that are connected to Freemasonry at the moment. The latest video that I put up online is called The Incalculable Genius of John Dee. And because my videos have been, in a sense, a work in progress, I'm lucky that I haven't found too many things that I actually think are wrong or repudiate, but I have been refining some of the thoughts and ideas. And that is my latest statement on what you've just mentioned, which is this idea, which might sound appalling and boring and embarrassing to some people, that Shakespeare de Vere was associated with the number 1740. This goes back to John Dee, who we've been talking about a little bit already. who said that everyone should meditate on the number of their name and connect it to the Trinity. And that sounds reasonably easy because we know that letters and numbers are often interchangeable. A is 1, B is 2. You can play it however you like, or you can look at the letter lengths of your name and somehow whittle it down to 3 and say, great, well, I've done that now. 3 is Trinity, and I can see the connection between my name and 3. But it's more complicated than that, unfortunately, because John Dee and all of this group, Shakespeare, Leonardo da Vinci, Leibniz, Newton, all these parts of these illuminated groups, if you like, these secret societies, believed that the Trinity wasn't a straightforward Trinity, that it actually consisted of the Holy Trinity as 3 parts, but also as the 4, the material world, the 4 elements: earth, fire, water, and sorry, my brain's gone fuzzy.
Air.
The air. Thank you, Andreas. You're concentrating at least. So no, it's this very, very fascinating idea that, as Dee keeps expressing it, and other people at that time, is that quaternary, i.e. the elements, are concealed within the ternary, i.e. the Trinity. So what he's actually saying is that the world, the material world, is actually part of God, that we are divine. And this goes back in some ways right back to Plato and to Pythagoras, who we've talked about, and to Hermes Trismegistus, particularly the idea that our mind is God's mind. Our bodies are also a part of the material world, a part of the Trinity. So back to the idea of the number of your name, that you need to connect to the Trinity. It's, as I said, it's more complicated because the Trinity is now a 4-fold, 3-fold Trinity. You have what you see, the 3 part, and the concealed 4 part. I mean, this is such a visual thing that I would urge your listeners, if they're curious and interested about that, to have a look at that video I put online called The Incalculable Genius of John Dee. Because there I explain exactly how Bacon, how Shakespeare chose the number of their name and how it all connects, and connects to the name Shakespeare too, which is mirroring the name Edward de Vere and the number of his name. Here is the title page. Should I get rid of this bit? You probably don't want to see that.
I love this bit. Are you kidding me? This is great. This is huge.
This is the title page of Shakespeare's sonnets that I was talking about. Now, a man called Alan Green, it wasn't me, but he noticed something really peculiar about this line. You see, I've drawn a line from the dot by the big G at the bottom, and it goes up to the D of it. There's a dot just by the D of imprinted. See that line? And by the way, before we already know that a big G is often associated with Freemasonry straight away. The other thing about Freemasonry, of course, it's to do with hidden things, hidden geometry, for instance. Well, there's an incredible hidden geometry right here. If you look at the bottom of the page, bottom half of the page, you'll see that it has those 2 horizontal lines that go off from left to right, if you like. And then at the bottom, you've got to be sold by William Aspley dot. And at the very bottom, you've got 1609 dot. Yeah. Well, this guy called Alan Green. Oh, look, I've got it. I've worked out how to do it. I pressed the mouse. Okay. So I'm really sorry. Let me resume. You'll see what's happening there. That we actually have 4 hidden perfect right-angled triangles just by joining the 2 ends of that line from G to imprinted dot to the line ends and to the dots at the bottom. And if you know anything about maths, you know about Thales' theorem, that if you've got right-angled triangles coming off the same hypotenuse, what you've got there is points on a perfect circle. Sorry, that is the sign I've just brought up there of known as the triple tau. And you can see, I pressed it rather quickly, but you can see that we call it triple tau, so we think it's 3 taus, that's 3 t's, but actually there's an upside down t. That you don't probably think about, but it's right there in the center. So this is a perfect symbolic representation of the Trinity with the quaternary that is hidden or concealed within the ternary. There's this perfect circle, if you see there, the points. And that's been hidden there. This was found by a guy called Alan Green. And I thought when I saw it was one of the most amazing things. And that tells me, by the way, straight away, that we've got Masons involved, Freemasons. Freemasons love nothing more than geometry, and they love nothing more than hiding things. What have we got here? Hidden geometry. straight away. And look where one of those key points is down there. It's by G. You remember the great sign of Freemasonry is a G in a square and compass. So then I worked out that if you come down through the stem of that P of Shakespeare's, you go right through the centre of that cross that I've just made. And so this gets more and more interesting and intriguing what's going on here, because what we found here, hidden all this time, is the famous Chi Rho symbol, the symbol of Christ. Christ, of course, says, ego sum veritas, I am the truth. So what truth is being hidden here? Well, the easiest way to work it out is to see where that symbol of Christ, where it's pointing. And you see there's several pointing bits on it. Before I go there, you just notice it's so brilliantly and accurately done this, that even the way it comes down through the centre of the P, that line, it goes just to the right-hand side of the capital N and the E of sonnets. That's telling us something is just a few degrees to the northeast, and that's very important in finding where Shakespeare's buried, which we may come to later. Then it goes straight down, it goes right into the centre of the circle, the centre of that cross, and then look how it divides the D of London down there. That's the initials ID, Eon D. Remember, there's no J in Latin, and John Dee often signs himself ID, right in the centre of a triangle, which is another way that he signs himself. So I think that's the signature of John Dee that's going on. He was the guy who created all of this amazing stuff. And then the line goes down to a dot just by where it says 4T. And that actually, funny enough, is what I discovered is where Shakespeare is buried. And Shakespeare's number is 1740. There's 17 letters in that line. And what, I don't know if I'll have time to show you this, but essentially you put this, you overlay this onto a map of the South Cross Aisle in Westminster Abbey, and that's the point that lands where he's actually buried. But just to show you, so there's your capital G that we're so used to seeing within the square of compass, the sign of the Freemasons, which is often interpreted as God, sometimes as geometer, who's the grand architect of the universe, which is the term that they use for the supreme creator of everything. So it's God. Now look where these little bits are pointing on the title page, the sign of Christ. Well, we see Shakespeare's sonnets by G, either they're by God, and look at the top right, DE, top left, VE, bottom right, RE. So they're by God and De Vere. This doesn't mean that God picked up the pen and wrote it, but it goes back to, again, this very Masonic idea, and actually an idea of St. Paul, that you create a creator or writer, or anyone who does anything, frankly, does it by the grace of God within them. They have the free will to write something, but they can't do anything without the inspiration and the grace of God within them. So what you're being told here, that Shakespeare's sonnets are by God and De Vere, and it's within this sign of Jesus, who is the truth, the Chi Rho symbol. And that's been hidden there all this time for 400 years, and there it is. And
so fascinating. It's so incontestable. How can you even hide that? And if you think about, so there's so many levels there. First off, the quadrinity and the Tau symbol, I think you mentioned earlier, the Grand Arch Royal Freemasonry in England, their symbol is that Tau, that triple Tau with a hidden St. Christopher's upside down cross Tau inside the upside down Tau in the three Taus. So
absolutely.
There's so much there. Plus, when we're looking at this idea of De Vere saying maybe he has a rightful place, or someone has a rightful place in the monarchy, and then all of a sudden King James, James VI and the First. So the Scots are familiar with Freemasonry for a generation before England is, at least publicly. Many people say that James was a Freemason, and we can see this push for.
He was undoubtedly a great supporter and patron of the Masons.
So where does this leave us in terms of the Freemasons have taken over culture? And is that what's going on in the 1600s, or the very beginning of the 1600s?
Well, in the 1700s is where it really comes in, because I can't answer about Queen Elizabeth. I do expect that she was some sort of connected in some way, but we know factually that the Stuarts were the Stuart kings were Freemasons. So that means James I, Charles I, and Charles II were all extremely important Freemasons.
And Charles II brought forth the libertine era. So do you see a goal here? And is it in Shakespeare for what sort of new world order, I'm sorry to call it anything else, that they were trying to build?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm absolutely certain that all of those kings I've just mentioned knew who Shakespeare was. In 1642, the king was effectively deposed and sent away, and there was a sort of Commonwealth period run by Puritans, by Oliver Cromwell, who curiously enough was himself a Freemason. So I don't know where this whole thing leads. Charles the First had his head chopped off in 1649, and the Restoration started in 1660 when his son Charles II came back and was put back on the throne, and we went back to having a monarchy in the old-fashioned way.
He was begged
Right.
to come back. They said, please stop smoking pot in Amsterdam and lied, and please come back and just promise us you'll guarantee our self-determination against democracy. These Puritans are taking away every privilege we have.
That's right. And in that period between 1642 and 1660, plays were banned by the Puritans. All the theatres were closed down. So one of the very first things that Charles did when at the Restoration, when he came back to the throne, I mean, very first, like in the first sort of month, the first second of becoming king, is he said, right, we're going to open up the theatres again. Not only that, we're going to reinstitute the King's Men, which were the players who were famous for being associated with Shakespeare, and we're going to start up a royal theatre by patent, which has exclusive rights to play Shakespeare's plays, and we'll call it the Vere Street Theatre. So, I mean,
that's
theatre,
audacious.
which was it was a tennis court known as the Vere Street Theatre. So they all knew it was Vere, and this goes on and on and on, and I've been tracing all the people who knew that Shakespeare was Vere, and it went on past the Restoration and on till 1709. Later, I found more and more people who seemed to know, and yet they all kept it a secret. And the extraordinary thing was that they were all hiding it using precisely the same keys. This triple tower that I showed you, the same lock is used to unlock this mystery in people writing about Shakespeare as early as 1595 and as late as 1759. And so they're all part of the same group. And of course, the tomb, as I said, the monument for Shakespeare put in Westminster Abbey, is full of all that. I can probably show it to you. And what you're looking at here, if you're still looking at this screen, is the sonnets and this arrow coming down, the line coming down to where it says 40, which was, of course, is a pun on the number 40 in a line of 17 things. And that's the little dot where he's buried. And you will need to see that presentation I put online called The Incalculable Genius of John Dee to understand this really thoroughly. But the point is that if you overlay one on top of the other, that's the significance of the Northeast I'm just showing you there. On the right there, you've got a ground plan of the what's known as the south transept of Westminster Abbey. We now know it as Poets' Corner. And what I'm just pointing out in this particular slide is that those pillars going upwards, you'd imagine they go due north, but actually they don't. They're a few degrees northeast, which is why it's so clever that that line passes just to the right of the N to show that northeast angle. Anyway, if you draw a circle going to the centers of those things, and then you overlap this sonnets thing where the fourth T is that little dot there, and that lands, interestingly enough, precisely on, I'll move it over. Can you see it moving over there? And it lands on that spot, that exact spot.
Man.
Exact
Euclid's
spot
fourth
there.
law, that's pretty brutal.
There you go, it lands exactly where the Shakespeare monument was placed in 1740. And this 1740 is all about the number of his name in a threefold, fourfold trinity. And actually it's all over this. It's all over this thing. This thing was erected in 1740.
1740 is one of the most incredible years for anyone who hasn't recognized the phantom time hypothesis has to do with the Gregorian calendar, the Julius calendar synchronization in 1740. It's a leap year, kind of like now. There's connections to the Pluto return. There's so many things about 1740, including the secret month. I think astrologers a couple of years ago mentioned that there was a month that was removed, and so many people's birthdays are 30 days different than they were during the 1740 Gregorian alignment that happened. There's just so much about the history and the calendar that changed in 1740, as well as the creation of this new history. You were saying that you've seen this before you knew about Shakespeare. When did you first visit this grave, or was it after?
Well, as I said, I worked out where Edward de Vere was buried, and I saw that it was a particular spot in Westminster Abbey, and I knew the exact spot. And I said to myself, when I overlay this map onto this bit, that will show me the spot. I'm going to get straight in the car and drive straight to Westminster Abbey and see if there's anything there that shows I'm right. And it landed smack on the Shakespeare monument. I mean, completely extraordinary. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things that's ever happened, really. So, as I say, this was put up in 1740, and I didn't know all those things about 1740 when I did this, but I since worked out how it is both Edward de Vere's name and William Shakespeare name put into, allied to the Trinity. If you look at this is where he's pointing to this scroll. I don't know if you can see that. Is that clear?
Yes,
I can see. You can see the cloud-cupped towers across the top line there. And they've gone and taken out the E. I wonder why, because that gives you 17 letters. And what do you see down the left-hand side? 4 T's. You've got 1740 again, exactly the same as you have on the monument in Stratford-upon-Avon, where in the bottom right-hand corner, you see you've got 4 T's with 17 characters alongside the bottom. It's as though they're a sort of a joint partnership, these two. And everything comes in threes with the hidden fourth. This is how the statue originally looked when it was put up in 1740. You see they've now removed those iron spears at the bottom, of which there are 17 fronting us. So you've got 17 spears across the front. And then if you look at the way he's standing, you've got a 4 and an X with his feet, X being 10, of course, in Roman numerals. So you've got 1740 facing you right there as you look at it. And then if you turn it around like that, I have to turn it around because I can't look at the back because it's got a wall behind it. But if you turn it around, then you see, in fact, he's holding up the shape of the chi rho symbol, which we saw before. And the rho is the 17th letter of the Greek alphabet, and the chi in biblical gematria is 40. So you've got your 1740 3 times as 1740, the number, the Trinity, and you've got the hidden part, the 4th T, as it were, with the pun on 1740, all sitting there.
This is just so great. So thinking about the 1740 connection to John Dee and perhaps Sir Francis Bacon, and Sir Francis Bacon wrote, I did a video recently on New Atlantis, how posthumously when he died, without it being in the table of contents, in Sylvum Savarum, they released his plan for a new world order on the new Western Hemisphere continent colonial schema. And you see a number of figures from the Rosicrucians and a few Scots that were involved with the prototypical Freemasonry going to America and starting to open the floodgates for non-puritanical Shakers and Quakers and all sorts of candlestick makers. Where does that fit? Do you think that John Dee, and why is it also that John Dee can be so occultist and Christian? Because I noticed that so much of this is about finding the G for the grand architect or God, or finding the symbol for Jesus. Jesus comes up for John Dee and for Ed de Vere too often not to be important.
So it starts with the belief that God created the world using letters and numbers. In the beginning was the Word. In the old Hebrew myth, if you want to call it that, there's a quarrel between various Hebrew letters to get the honor of creating the world through God. And therefore, to the scientific mind of the 16th and 17th centuries, the way to understand God is to look at his creation. As I've explained to you, they believe that God's creation, the material world, is part of God himself. Therefore, to get close to God, to understand God, we must study the material world. And that could be looking at ants through a microscope or looking at the stars in the heaven, but just to understand the material world is to get close to God. Now, on the side of that, so that's where Bacon is, and that's where Dee is very strongly. But beyond that, there is this idea of a sort of unification and a world run by elites. We're beginning to hear that now in the current climate. A world that is run by elites who have the same religious and aesthetic outlook. And now John Dee is apparently the one who coined the term British Empire. And certainly in what you've just described then about the New Atlantis of Bacon, it's again part of the same thing. And there are a lot of theories that America, and most particularly Washington D.C., for instance, in the street plan of how Washington was set up, that these are all the same sort of groups in different periods of time who set up America, and that America is essentially founded on principles that we can see running secretively in John Dee, in Francis Bacon, and in others prior to that, in England and in Germany. I've just actually read quite an interesting book, which I can recommend to you. It's called The Royal Arch of Enoch, by someone called Robert Sullivan. Quite a long book, but absolutely fascinating. The impact of Masonic ritual, philosophy in symbolism, and very much about the making of America and how that was done through that. So I hope I've answered your question as succinctly as possible.
I can't believe anyone could possibly do a better job. I know that this is one of those things where you can't abridge this content into an American format and have it in less than 20 minutes. So I'm sure in the future, we're going to have to talk again. There's so much more I could wax on about with you. Lady Teresa, her book on Astolph and his visit to the Rus translated. I think there's so much more that we could look at in terms of the Tartar connection. You know, Shakespeare talks about East Tartary, Bacon talks about Tartary. There's so much about this idea of a new post-Merovingian, post-nepotistic foundling era that comes up, where they're saying we're going to get rid of the royals and we're going to have this ideology of the self-made man. But the hubris of believing that Shakespeare was a self-made man instead of someone that was built up is not just wrong, it's dangerous. And I hope that the work that you've done helps so many more people, and indeed this entire civilization, to know what's happening, where some elite are controlling and persuading the beliefs of the layman. So I appreciate what you've shown. I wonder also if you have anything that you'd like to say about work that you're doing in the future. What else is coming for you?
I've just completed with an American scholar called Roger Strittmatter, a 2-volume book on all of the contemporary allusions to Shakespeare. I think I mentioned to you that every single person who discusses Shakespeare at the time knew perfectly well that it was a pseudonym and knew who was behind that pseudonym. So what we've done is to take every single mention of Shakespeare from 1593, that's the first time the name it comes up in a literary context, all the way through till 1776, and shown how every single person knew that he was Edward de Vere using a pseudonym. I can't tell you exactly when that's going to be published. It is finished and we're just going through the final stages of correcting it. But that's a big project. And then my other big project at the moment is writing a script for a 9-part dramatic series of Edward de Vere's life, in which those who are ignorant and don't know that he's associated with Shakespeare will discover in episode 7 that he's actually William Shakespeare. But his life is so extraordinary and so interesting and so full of adventure that they should be utterly gripped by what's going on in his life anyway. And then the astonishing cream on the cake, if you like, will be when they discover he's William Shakespeare as well.
That's absolutely brilliant. I can't wait to see that. I know it'll be probably the best show. So I can't wait.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great joy, and I hope that I've made things as clear as possible. It is always my effort to make these complicated matters easy. And I would urge people who are a little bit muddled to go and see some of the presentations I put online on YouTube, where I've made them as clear as I possibly can.
Mr. War, I wanted to say thank you. A blessing on the war and the houses of war. I appreciate everything that you guys are doing.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.